I'm about to tell you advice which is going to completely change the way you view writing hooks into your stories. I plan for this video to be a relatively short one because, just like with my other video on writing beginnings, I don't think you should obsess over getting this part down perfectly. I know there's a lot of advice people tend to give on this topic, and for good reason. Every story has a beginning, and therefore every story needs a good hook to get the audience invested. So how can we go about doing something like that? Well, my first advice is that a good hook is not necessarily something which is action-packed. In fact, it could be the exact opposite. Let's imagine a story which opens up with a massive and spectacular battle between the House of Roses and the House of Swords. Now, we know absolutely nothing at all about the House of Swords or the House of Roses, aside from the fact that neither is very creative with their naming conventions. Let's imagine that the book shows us a big battle scene with soldiers fighting up against cavalry and explosions happening all around. We can see them fighting each other, but that's about it. And just like I advised in my video on writing fight scenes, this is not only a bad hook, it's also just a bad way to write fight scenes into a story. If you want your characters to fight something in the first chapter, then I would remember that a fight doesn't start when fists are thrown, but rather when words are exchanged and ideals clash. A good hook, in this instance, would be to find a way which we can quickly establish why the House of Swords despises the House of Roses so much. Open the scene with a statement from the perspective of someone in either of these noble houses. For example, if my character was a member of the House of Swords, I would open the story with the following. The House of Roses had taken Charlie's mother from her, ransacked her family's estate, killed her favorite dog, and had the gall to ask if she and her family wanted to show up for tea later that week. A hook like this quickly establishes some key details, such as the name of our main character, as well as the core conflict of the story. It also adds a bit of humor, while quickly getting the audience on our main character's side, against the House of Roses. A hook like this would by no means be a perfect way to start the story. In fact, it is only a rough draft and something that I created specifically for this script. I'm sure I could find an even better hook with this random story that I came up with while writing the script. However, that's the next point that I actually want to drive home. Finding a good hook is less about agonizing for hours over how to start your story with the perfect sentence that's going to capture the attention of your audience, and more about how you choose to focus your story. You see, making an interesting hook is less about crafting the perfect sentence and more about establishing what's interesting about your story and why the people in the audience should continue to watch or read it. You should break down the most important and interesting things you want to establish about your world, characters, and plot, and try to boil it down to its most basic parts. Starting the story in a fight scene, for example, might sound like an engaging hook at first, but without any context or proper build-up, it's just two people punching one another in a nondescript void. Because while many people recognize the hook of a story, not many people think about the line which needs to follow the hook. After all, the line behind a hook in a fishing rod is what reels in the fish. If all you have is the hook, you're not going to get the fish. And the reader, being the fish in this instance, will need more than just a single perfect sentence to hook them in. A hook should accomplish three things, first and foremost. The first is that it establishes something about your world, its characters, or the driving conflict of your story. The second is that it leaves a question in the reader's mind, while also promising an answer later on. The third is that it is immediately followed by a good line which takes the audience deeper into the story and works towards fulfilling that promise which has been made to the audience beforehand. A strong statement, a metaphor, a short story, or a vivid description which immerses the reader are all valid hooks that you can use for your story. Not every hook needs to be action-packed, and not every story needs to grab your attention from the first line and drag you through a fast-paced action sequence. Some of the best stories in fiction have slow starts, but they still manage to provide a good hook and a good promise to their readers. They still manage to provide a question in the back of the reader's mind, overall a sense of wonder. If, by the end of the first chapter, you can leave your readers with that inner need to read more and live in your world for a bit longer, then you have accomplished your goal, regardless of whether or not your opening hook is good. The second way I want to help you with writing hooks is less about direct advice and categorization of the types of hooks you can make, and more about changing the way you tackle the problem of writing a good hook. Writing a good hook means you should do some proper research first, as with anything when it comes to writing. However, the research that I want you to do in specific is to think about stories which you enjoy and then try to focus on that first sequence. Most of us might not remember how a story got us hooked in, or how it captured our attention and kept us reading or kept us watching. What I want you to do is try to judge whether or not these stories that you love actually have good hooks or if they have bad hooks. What you might find is that not every story starts in a good way. Some stumble in the beginning, but some get much better later, so you keep engaging with it anyway. However, you'll probably find quite a few stories which are great at grabbing the audience's attention. Try to write a story with a similar opening to the one that you enjoy the hook of. The practice that I want you to do is to find a story which you think has a good hook and then try to emulate it in your own story. This is more of an exercise than anything else. Break down the hook of your favorite story into its most basic parts and then reuse that fundamental structure for your own hook. I'm not saying copy it, I'm not saying steal or plagiarize or do any of that. I'm saying break it down to its most basic parts and then rebuild it up with the details from your own story. For example, if I were to write the opening hook of my story in the same way that Frieren writes their opening hook, I would first want to know what type of hook it is. Frieren begins with an overview of the map and a simple blurb about Aurael. It reads, "At the northern end of the continent, I arrived at a place that the people of this world call heaven, Aurael, the land where souls rest." Fundamentally, this is a world-building focused hook, and it is one which is written by a very vague writer from the beginning. This is only the first sentence, and therefore it is the hook of the story. However, as I just discussed earlier, a hook is about more than just the first sentence. It's about the line which follows it. This is a pretty good hook because it leaves us with a few questions to answer, while also establishing some key details about the world we're about to engage with. From this opening line, we are immediately greeted to a fantasy-type vibe and some information about where things lie in the world without over-explaining things to the point where I just don't care anymore. We're introduced to the concept of Aurael, which is going to be the main destination for which Frieren and her group travels for the rest of the story. We're also left to wonder who is writing this in the first place, until we are given that information in the following line of this hook. "Many souls gather here, and I spoke with friends who once fought alongside me. Flam, the legendary mage." Now, we know nothing about Flam, the legendary mage. However, we do know that they are important enough to the world to be quoted as a historical figure. After this quote, and a quick look at the map, we are introduced to a scene of Frieren and her party returning from a successful campaign. If I were to emulate this style of an opening hook in my own story, I would first analyze the structure of the opening. I have to pick a quote from a character in my world who is not necessarily irrelevant to the story, but who is also not our main character. I need to choose an important scholar who knows quite a bit about the world, someone who is worth quoting in the historical texts of my setting. I also need to write the hook from the perspective of someone who is journaling their experience, so it will be a statement from the first person. Then, once I've finished my quote, I would have to describe the setting and situation our main character finds themselves in. For Frieren, they have their nose deep in a magical tome on a day with clear skies and moderate weather. Finally, the quote I must use must also be related to the overarching journey which my main character will take. A rail is the destination of the story. It is the main goal for which our characters strive towards. So any of the locations and things that I mention in the quote must be relevant to the overarching narrative and plot of my story. I came up with the following. In the many realms I have traveled, only two stand as bastions of hope and perseverance against the vile corruption of the Malaki. The land of mortal gods, Litheria, and the land of dragons, Ataro. It is my hope we can learn from these two worlds that warding away death is inviting monsters and madness into our very souls. In the case of my homeland of Ataro, however, we often teach this lesson through blood and conflict, whether another world wants to listen or not. Loctir the Grey. After which, I would open a new scene with our main character, Drakey Eric, much in the same way that I do already. It was times like these, when Drakey was spying on someone, that he felt someone else was watching him the most. For me personally, I think Friren's style of an opening tends to force me to convey details about my setting, which I don't really want to establish right away. I think it's a lot more engaging for me to simply start with my main character and leave the quote from Loctir out of it. However, it's still a very good way to start my story, and if I ever wanted to establish that part of the world from the get-go, this is how I would go about it. You see, what you need to do in this exercise is you need to weigh the pros and cons of how this hook has started your story. Understand what your goals are when it comes to writing a hook and what you want to do with that hook. And try to see if that style of writing fits the way that you intend to tell your story. You can do this for any opening. Even if it's not an opening that you end up using, what's most important about writing a good hook is experimenting. And that's the key secret of this entire video. You should not be paralyzed trying to think of the greatest hook you possibly can. If you are stuck trying to write a great hook, it is because the fear of failure is holding you back. Don't be afraid to write a bad hook. Bad writing and failure is necessary for making something good. Making mistakes and failing at what you try to do is a necessary part of learning and growing as a writer. The faster you fail and learn from those failures, the faster you will find the true hook of your story. What I've just outlined for you is both a way to achieve a workable hook which you can leave into your story while you write the rest of the story, as well as a way of practicing and deconstructing how to write hooks altogether. This is advice which will always be useful because it doesn't tell you what you should think, it tells you how you should think. So to review, find a story that you enjoy. Take a look at the hook of that story, and then try to replicate the style of that hook in your own story. Then, try to review what you've learned from writing your hook in that style. Test some things out, and don't be afraid to fail along the way. This is practice and methodology for getting good at writing hooks. The more you do this, the better you will get at creating your own unique hooks from scratch. It is only through doing something like this that you're going to gather the knowledge and experience necessary to craft a stellar opening to your story. View writing a hook as its own individual skill, something which you can train with some good practice and methodology. Something which you can repeatedly do until it becomes second nature to you. I can sit here and give you more advice and examples about how to go about things. I could probably make this video a lot longer and a little bit more engaging for the YouTube algorithm. But I don't think any of those examples or padding out the video is going to help you more than taking action will right now in this very moment. Your writing might never be perfect. In fact, I will say it is never going to be perfect because there is no such thing as perfection in the first place. There is only you and yourself in your own way. So make your first step as one which helps you get out of your own way. Find some good stories you want to emulate right now in this moment. Open a document and start writing.